Today I'm going to show you how I made these brush rolls. This one is for paintbrushes and was my father's birthday present last year, and this one is for makeup brushes and was a replacement for the very grubby one that you'll be seeing in a minute. Obviously these can be made for any kind of long thin thing that you want to store. They'd work really well for knitting needles, for crochet hooks. I've seen somebody make one for corset boning. Any long thin thing that you need to store, this will work really well for. I haven't included any fabric requirements for these brush rolls because obviously depending on the size of the thing that you want to store in there will depend on the size that you need to make the brush roll. Some will be bigger than others. One thing I will say though is if you are going to be using it for paintbrushes, makeup brushes, anything that could possibly have anything like residue left over on them, you do want to consider a wipe clean fabric for the interior of the roll itself and also the interior of the flap that covers the top of the brushes. Other than that, you can pick any fabrics that you like. I've used quilting cotton and a cotton canvas for the two that I've made so far. I'll show you the process for making this one, so let's get started. I think we can agree that my makeup brush roll has seen better days. These used to be the same as this, so all of the faux leather has peeled off. I mean, the inside of the brush roll is technically still functional, but there's a few holes, so the brushes do fall out. Obviously I haven't cleaned this one for a while, but it's in need of replacing. I did make a brush roll for my dad for his paintbrushes. This one is going to be for my makeup brushes, and you can literally make one of these for any kind of long thin thing that you want to have stored. You just need to measure the longest thing that you want to put in it and do your measurements from there. So this one is actually a little longer than I have. I would say this one is 20 inches because this is 18, so it's 20 inches long and it is just a touch over 9 inches wide. I actually have a few more makeup brushes than fit into these holders, so I'm going to make mine 25 long, 10 tall. Then this piece is 3.5 and this piece up here is 4, and then 15.5 long, as in finish measurement. This bottom piece needs to obviously be a lot longer than that because it needs to have, you know, the ability to get things in it, so it needs to be concertinaed. But this top piece is 15 inches long. This is 15 inches and I've added 5, so I'm going to do 20, and it is 4 inches tall. And then, like I say, this one down here is 3.5 inches. So I'm actually going to cut this one at 4 inches by 35 inches long because I'd rather have it too long and I cut off excess, which is what I did with the paintbrush roll, rather than it be too short and I don't have enough spaces for the amount of brushes that I want. The things that you will need are some kind of wipe clean fabric. This is actually a shower curtain that I bought, or it's maybe oilcloth, but I think it's kind of it's slightly lighter than oilcloth, but you could use vinyl, for example. I did do that with the paintbrush roll. Yes, you want something that is wipe clean for the interior of the roll and also the interior of this flap that covers the top of the brushes. You want your outer fabric, I'm going for a flamingo theme, and bias binding. So I'm going to use this absolutely gorgeous rainbow bias binding that the very lovely Karen sent me. I had about 63 meters and I'm still going through it. This is going to last me not quite a lifetime, but a decent chunk of my sewing life. So bias binding, and this is going to cover all of the raw edges, and it's also going to make the ties for the final roll so that it can be tied up when it is rolled shut. And then I have some Violin H630 interfacing. This stuff is kind of slightly spongy. I like the idea of having something slightly spongy, and I will only be interfacing the fabric outer of the bag and this piece here. I am using a cotton canvas that does have a decent amount of structure to it. I might use some Pellon SF 101 or Violin F220 interfacing for just that piece, just for a little structure, but I don't want anything as thick as this one. So now that we've got our fabrics together, we've got our pattern together, I am going to get all of those pieces cut out and I'll go through them with you and what we're going to be doing with them in order to construct this makeup brush roll. These are the pieces that I have. I've got my outer interfacing, and then my white clean inner. These are all exactly the same measurement, which is 10 inches tall, and actually these ones are 20 inches long because I only had that much of this fabric. I would ideally have liked it to be 25 inches long, but I have to work with what I've got. So that's the inner and outer frame. Then we have the flap. So I've got the lining piece of the flap, I've got the outer of the flap, and then the interfacing of the flap, and they are going to get sandwiched together with bias binding. I've then got the brush holder itself, and this is 4 inches wide and as much fabric as I had left, which I think is about 30 inches, and I have cut out some Pellon SF 101 or Violin F220 interfacing, and I'm going to interface that first. I've also cut 2 strips of bias binding that I'm going to make into my ties by folding them in half and top stitching them down, and these are 24 inches long. The rest of the bias binding that I'm going to use, I will leave on the roll and just sew it as I need it. I don't want to cut anything to a specific length. I prefer to sew from my roll. So I'm going to get everything interfaced that needs to be, and then we can start putting pieces together. So the first thing that we need to do is finish off the top edge of what is going to be the brush holder. I'm going to do that with bias binding because I think it's going to look really pretty and I like that finish. So you could turn this over and over again and top stitch that down. You could actually cut another piece of fabric the same width and sew the top edge together and press them flat and top stitch. I'm just going to use bias binding because I think it looks really pretty and it's a finish that I like. I personally do sew my bias binding on in 2 passes. You don't have to. I just find it easier to get it neat that way. So I'm going to open out the bias binding. I'm going to put the raw edge along the back side or the wrong side of my fabric and stitch in that ditch. And I do have a directional print, so I'm going to make sure that my flamingos are the correct way up, and I'm sewing the bias binding to the top edge of the piece, so where the flamingo heads are. So I'm going to get that done, then I can fold it over and top stitch it into place. So I've sewn the bias binding on to the wrong side, and now I'm going to wrap it around that edge and top stitch it as close as I can to the folded edge just to finish that edge off. So you should end up with something that looks like this, and I have pressed the bias binding flat, and I've also pressed under, as you've got the bottom there, the right hand side as you're, this is the left hand side for me, but right hand side as you're looking at it if it was the right way up for you, because that's the bit that's going to get stitched down here. So the next thing that we need to do is make some markings for what are going to be our brush loops and the top stitching that we need to do for those brush loops. My original brush roll has 18 loops in it, and so I'm going to go for the same because I've gone for the same measurements. The wider you make your brush loop, the more you can add. If I had had enough to do the 25-inch long one, I would have added another sort of 3, 4, 5 possibly brush loops in. So you want them to be different widths. So the first ones that we're going to do, and I'm using my Prim chalk pencil, which I will link in the description down below. I've just broken the nib of the chalk. I'm going to do 2 inches, and I'm going to do 5 of those. So I'm literally just drawing lines 2 inches apart. 4, 5, and I'm going to make a note. So I've got 5 times 2 inches, and then I'm going to do 1 and a half inches, so maybe 5 of these. I've misdrawn, so I've done 5 at 2 inches. I've got 1 at 1 by 1 inch, and then I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 at 1.5 inches, so 4 times 1.5 inches, and then 5 at 1 inch. I've got 15, so I've got space for 3 more, so I might do some more 2-inch ones. 1, 2, and 3. So the reason that we did the marking of the key was so that we could place it on to this piece, our wipe clean interior, in the correct spacing. So we want to mark in 5 inches, and this is a wipe clean, so I'm using a friction pen here, and we're going to line up this folded edge here 5 inches in from the edge, and then we need to make markings that we can actually see. And so for the 2 inch, we want to make a mark at 1 inch. So 1 inch by 5. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then we've got 1 at 1 inch. So that's going to be 1/2 inch. And then we've got 1.5 inches. So they're going to be by 4. So 3/4 inch. And then we need 5 at 1/2 inch. 2, 3, 4, 5. And then we've got another 3 at 2 inches. So they're going to be 1 inch apart. And then I've got a little bit extra at the end that I will just fudge in. Basically, whatever width of marking that you've made onto the brush holder, you want to halve it for the wipe clean fabric. What we're going to do now is we're going to line up the raw edge of this piece, and we're going to line it up with our 5 inch mark, and you're going to top stitch down here, back stitching at the beginning and the end, and then you're going to bring this mark and you're going to bunch it up so that it meets to the 1 inch mark that you've made, and top stitch that into place, and then you will end up with a ripply piece of fabric that will technically hold your brushes into place. So I'm going to go over to the sewing machine and get that started, and I'll show you what it looks like once I've got a few in place. If you're following along with me, then again I will have listed in the description down below the dimensions that I'm actually using, but you can make this up and make this work for you and whatever size of thing that you are storing. So let's get some of them sewn and I'll show you what that looks like. So you should be ending up with, you can see they're like loops. The way that I like to do it is I've top stitched down this first edge, then I take a wonder clip and I will move this marking along to meet the one. So this is the 2 inch marking, this is 1 inch marking, so I'll move the marking along so that they meet up. And then because I've cut this accurately, I'm making sure that the straight edge at the bottom is straight with the wipe clean fabric, and then I'll put my wonder clip on because that just helps everything to stay in place. And I'll fold all the fabric over, and then I'll back stitch at the start and sew down that line of marking that we made and back stitch at the bottom. And I'm just going to keep doing that the whole way along until I have concertinaed up all of my outer fabric so that it can hold my brushes. As I say, you want to take your marking and slide it along so that it matches up with the marking on the wipe clean fabric. Make sure that the bottom edge is nice and parallel with each other. Put a wonder clip on so that it holds it into place, and top stitch down along the marking that you made earlier, and do that the whole way along, obviously alternating sizes and depending on the size of markings that you have made. Once you are done, you should end up with something that looks like this. You can see they're all concertinaed out, and yes, I am using multicolored thread to go with the bias binding. Rachel got it for me in my advent calendar last year. So you can see here that there's loads of just straight lines that are different widths apart that correspond with the different marks that we made onto the brush holder fabric earlier. So the next thing that we're going to need to do is smoosh down the bottoms of our brush roll pieces so that they kind of form pleats at the bottom. You don't really want to, with the bigger ones especially, you don't really want to push it all over to one side. You kind of want to push it flat so that you end up with a little pleat either side. You can go through with your wonder clips and clip that all into place, and we want to sew all the way along the bottom edge to secure those into place. You want to sew within your seam allowance, and for me the seam allowance is the width of my bias binding, so 3/8 of an inch. So I'm going to sew along the bottom here, making all of those pleats at 1/4 of an inch to secure everything into place. So you can just about see there that I have sewn down the bottoms of everything and flattened them all out. Definitely not perfect, but you don't need it to be perfect. So the next thing I'm going to do is just trim off this excess piece here. We don't need that. And then I can put this to the side, and the next thing that we need to do is work on the flap that is going to cover the tops of our brushes and keep everything clean, because we will have the white clean surface underneath. On my original, these corners are rounded, and I have found that actually a pint glass, the bottom of a pint glass, is a really good shape for rounding out those corners. So I'm just going to do that to both sides. The bottom of this pint glass, it's about 2.5 inches in diameter, so just so that you've got a measurement. I've got my flamingos the correct way up, and I'm rounding out the bottom corners. So this is the top edge, this is the bottom edge, and when we fold this piece up, you want to be able to see the flamingos the right way up. So I have got the flamingo's head along the bottom edge of this. So these, if you are using directional fabrics, they are opposite on this piece. So the first thing that I'm going to do is baste all along this edge here, and I'm going to do that within the 3/8 of an inch that my bias binding is wide, and I'm going to follow those curves that I've drawn in. Once I've sewn them together, then I can cut those curves off once the white clean piece and the fabric is one piece basted together, as it were. I have basted that together, and I have cut off the corner that we marked earlier, and I'm going to do the same for the other side. And I'm rounding the corners because it's just easier to sew bias binding. You can obviously mitre your corners if you want to keep them square, but for me this is the original, what the original done, and I really like the look of it. So I'm now going to take my bias binding and I'm going to finish off this raw edge, and I'm going to do the same thing I did last time, sew it to the wrong side, or the side that won't be seen the most often first, wrap it around, top stitch it down, and then we can attach this to the inner piece that we've just sewn the brush holder to. You should end up with something that looks like this. You're going to need to take the inside main body piece, and you want to center this over the brush roll, but you don't want it to be right to the end. You want it to be offset by, let's say, 1/2 inch, because again we're going to round this corner and bind this corner. So I'm going to clip this into place and baste it into place at 1/4 inch all the way around. Then we can make our ties. The flap is basted into place, so I'm going to put this to the side. I have taken my bias binding ties and I have folded over one short edge by about 3/8 of an inch, and I'm now going to fold the bias binding completely in on itself, and I'm going to top stitch all along that folded edge to make this into a tie, and I'm going to do the same for both bias binding pieces. And here are my two finished ties. Technically you only need to sew down the open side, but I like to sew down the open side, go round the bottom corner and then come back the other edge, because I think it just looks really pretty, and it also gives the ties a little bit more stability. So I'm going to set these aside for now, and the next thing that we need to do is take our outer fabric, and you want to make sure, if you've got a directional print like I do, you want to make sure that your flamingos are facing the right direction. I mean, whatever you have that's directional is facing the right direction. And we're going to layer on top the inner white clean piece that we've done. Now I'm going to go around and baste this into place, and then I'm going to round out the corners on this one using the same pint glass that I used for these rounded corners, just so that again it's easier to do the bias binding and to give it a kind of cohesive look. But it will be easier for me to baste this into place first and then do the rounding of the corners. So let's get that done, and literally I'm going to sew all the way around at 1/4 inch within the seam allowance of my 3/8 of an inch of my bias binding. I have everything basted together, and I have drawn on my little quarter circles, or the 2.5 inch rounds from the pint glass that I'm using. So I'm going to just join up the top stitching within that seam allowance around those corners so that I can trim those off for the bias binding later. And then the other thing that we need to do is put on the ties that we made to this end. So it's the end with nothing, no brush holder or anything in it. And we need to find the halfway point. So for me, that is 5 inches, and make a mark. And then you want to take the ends that aren't the folded over end. So this is a folded over end and that's a raw edge. And that's the same piece. There we go. Here we go. Yeah. So you want to take the folded, you want to take your 2 ties with the raw edges and you want to meet your ties up either side of that 5-inch mark like that. And you're going to clip them into place and you're going to top stitch or baste those into place as well, whilst you're basting the rounded corners. You want to make sure that the ties are coming across the body of the roll like this. You don't want them facing the other way. So I'm going to baste those into place, baste around the corners, trim the corners, and then we can put on the bias binding to finish the makeup brush roll. I have basted on my ties and I have rounded out my corners, and I'm going to class the inside as the wrong side. So that's where I'm going to sew my bias binding to first. I'm also going to start my bias binding by folding over one edge like this by about 3/8 of an inch and top stitching that down, so that when I come round all the way around I'll be able to overlay another 3/8 of an inch of the raw edge of the bias binding, and that will give me a nice clean finished edge. The thing I don't want to do is overlay it over here because this is obviously already bulky, but I'm going to start it kind of like there, so it's not near these ties, so that I'm not adding extra bulk. So I'm going to get this sewn on all the way around, then we can trim any excess around the corners to help us turn it over and get nice neat round corners, and top stitch it down, and then it'll be done, which I of course will show you. It's starting to look very colourful. So this is what the ends look like. So that's the beginning where I turned it under, and then I have just overlapped by 3/8 of an inch and sewn that down. Now I'm going to go and trim a little bit off of these corners, not a lot, but it's just going to help me to round the corners out nicely. So I want to make sure that I'm not cutting the bias binding, and just take a little bit extra off of the corners so that when I turn everything around it'll go nicely. You do want to make sure that you aren't kind of like over wrapping it around like that. That's not what we want to end up with. You want to have nice, neat and even bias binding the whole way around, but just taking that little bit off the corner does help that. So I'm going to do that for the other 3 corners, and then I will top stitch all the way around, and then we're done. And with that last little bit of top stitching, the makeup brush roll is done. So it's going to end up looking something like this, and we've got our flamingo the right way up when you fold that back as well. And I've got space for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 19 brushes, so 1 more than my original brush roll. Some of these are big enough that I will be able to double them up like I have been doing before. As I mentioned, if you do want to put more brushes in, just add extra length on. I would add on increments so that it would fold up neatly. I think that makes sense. So like adding another 5 inches, this piece would have been 5 inches longer, and then there would have been another this 5-inch gap here, and then it would have rolled just 1 more time into its storage position. But I am really pleased with this, and I think it looks really, really cute with the rainbow bias binding on it. It wouldn't have normally been my first choice, but I think it works. I'm really, really pleased with how this one has come out. I need to actually wash all my makeup brushes before I put them in here, but I have put in 1 just to make sure that they actually fit. If you do decide to make your own one of these, please do use the hashtag Sian made me do it, because I would love to see what you come up with and what use you put yours to and what fabric combinations that you pick. I really hope you've enjoyed today's tutorial. If you have any questions at all, please let me know in the comments section down below and I will do my best to answer them for you. If you've enjoyed this video, you might want to check out this one here.